The silence in the sprawling mansion on the Upper East Side was a heavy, suffocating blanket for Eleanor Vance. It had only been 3 months since her husband Richard had passed away, but the void he left seemed to expand with each passing day, swallowing the echoes of their 50 years together. The grand staircase, which had once been the backdrop for countless family photographs, now loomed like a silent, judgmental sentinel. The ornate ballroom, where they had danced on their silver anniversary, was a cavern of memories, each one a painful reminder of what she had lost. At 72, Eleanor felt adrift in a sea of grief, her life's anchor suddenly gone. Her only solace was her son Julian, her and Richard's only child. Julian, a man in his late 40s, with his father's sharp business acumen and a smile that could charm the most hardened of cynics, had been a pillar of strength for Eleanor. He had handled all the funeral arrangements with a quiet efficiency that she, in her fog of sorrow, had been immensely grateful for. He visited her daily, bringing her groceries, managing her appointments, and patiently listening to her endless stream of reminiscences about Richard. "You don't have to worry about a thing, Mom," he would say, his voice a soothing balm on her raw nerves. "I'll take care of everything. Dad would have wanted me to." And Eleanor, who had always relied on Richard to handle their finances and major life decisions, had readily agreed. She had never been one for numbers and legal jargon, finding the world of stocks and estates to be a bewildering maze. Richard had always shielded her from it, and now Julian was doing the same. It was a comfort, a continuation of the sheltered life she had always known. Or so she thought. About a month after the funeral, Julian sat down with her in the library, a room filled with the scent of old leather and Richard's favorite cigars. He held a stack of papers in his hand, his expression a carefully crafted mask of concern. "Mom," he began, his tone gentle, "we need to talk about your finances." He explained that while Richard had left her a substantial inheritance, the upkeep of the mansion alone was a significant drain. "It's a lot for you to manage on your own," he said, "and frankly, it's not a practical living situation for you anymore." He proposed a plan that, on the surface, seemed eminently sensible. He suggested they sell the mansion and a large portion of Richard's art collection. With the proceeds, he would invest in a diversified portfolio that would provide her with a steady, comfortable income for the rest of her life. He had already found a lovely modern apartment for her in a new luxury building downtown. "It's much smaller, of course," he said, "but it's secure, has a doorman, and is close to all the best shops and restaurants. You'll be much more comfortable there." Eleanor was hesitant at first. The mansion was more than just a house. It was the repository of her life's happiest moments. The thought of leaving it was like a second bereavement. But Julian was persuasive. He painted a picture of a new, carefree life for her, free from the burdens of managing a large estate. He showed her brochures of the apartment, with its sleek modern design and panoramic city views. "It's a new beginning, Mom," he had urged, his eyes full of earnest conviction. "A chance for you to start fresh." And so, with a heavy heart, Eleanor had agreed. She trusted her son implicitly. He was, after all, her flesh and blood, the boy she had raised to be a good, honorable man. She signed the papers he put in front. Of her hand guided by his, not bothering to read the fine print. Why should she? Julian was taking care of her, just as he had promised. The move was a blur of packing boxes and emotional farewells to familiar rooms. Julian handled the sale of the mansion and the art collection with his usual efficiency. He told her the real estate market was in a slump and that they had to sell for less than they had hoped, but he assured her it was still a substantial sum. He set up a new bank account for her and gave her a debit card, telling her he would manage the rest of her investments. You just focus on settling in and enjoying your new life, he said with a reassuring smile. The new apartment, while luxurious, felt cold and sterile compared to the warmth and character of the mansion. The minimalist furniture, which Julian had picked out, felt alien to her. The doormen were polite but impersonal, a far cry from the friendly staff who had worked for her and Richard for decades. Eleanor felt like a guest in her own home, a stranger in her own life. The first crack in her gilded cage appeared a few weeks after she had moved in. She had gone to her favorite boutique on Madison Avenue to buy a new dress for a charity luncheon. When she presented her debit card at the counter, it was declined. The embarrassment was acute, a hot flush that spread up her neck and cheeks. The salesgirl, who had known Eleanor for years, was discreet and apologetic. Eleanor, flustered and confused, paid with the small amount of cash she had in her purse, and hurried out of the store. When she called Julian to tell him what had happened, he was quick to apologize. "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice laced with concern. "There must have been a mix-up at the bank. I'll sort it out right away." The next day, he came over with a bouquet of her favorite lilies and a new debit card. He explained that there had been a temporary hold on her account, a security measure, and that everything was fine now. He was so charming, so contrite that she had pushed her unease aside. It was just a mistake, she told herself. These things happened. But then, other small, unsettling things began to happen. The monthly statements from her investment portfolio, which Julian had promised to send, never arrived. When she asked him about them, he would wave his hand dismissively and say, "Don't worry your pretty little head about it, Mom. I've got it all under control." He started visiting her less frequently, always with a ready excuse about being busy with work. When he did visit, he seemed distracted, his eyes constantly darting to his phone. The easy, affectionate rapport they had always shared was replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible tension. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon, about 6 months after Richard's death. Eleanor was going through a box of old photographs, a bittersweet journey into the past, when she came across a small leather-bound notebook. It was Richard's private journal, a place where he jotted down his thoughts and ideas. She had never read it while he was alive, feeling it was an invasion of his privacy. But now, in her loneliness and growing unease, she felt a desperate need to connect with him, to hear his voice again, even if it was just through the written word. She opened the journal to the last entry, dated just a week before he died. His familiar, elegant script filled the page. He wrote about his love for her, his fears about his failing, health, and his hopes for her future. And then she saw it, a sentence that made the blood run cold in her veins. "I have made all the necessary arrangements to ensure Eleanor will be well taken care of," he had written. "Fitzgerald has the final papers. I pray that Julian will do the right thing, but I have my doubts. Greed is a powerful and corrosive force, and I fear my son has inherited my head for business, but not my heart. Fitzgerald." The name jolted her. Harrison Fitzgerald had been Richard's lawyer and closest friend for over 40 years. She hadn't seen him since the funeral. Julian had told her that Fitzgerald was semi-retired and had handed over all of Richard's affairs to a new, younger lawyer at the firm. It had seemed plausible at the time, but now, Richard's words, his chilling premonition, echoed in the silent, sterile apartment. A cold, hard knot of fear began to form in the pit of her stomach. The declined debit card, the missing statements, Julian's evasiveness. It all started to coalesce into a terrifying picture. She had been a fool, a blind, trusting fool, She had willingly handed over her entire life to her son, never once questioning his motives. And now, as the rain lashed against the panoramic windows of her luxurious prison, Eleanor Vance finally understood. She was not being cared for. She was being controlled. And she had a sinking feeling that she had been betrayed in the most profound and devastating way imaginable. The gilded cage, which she had mistaken for a sanctuary, was in fact a trap, and the man she had trusted most in the world was the one who had locked the door. For a long moment, Eleanor sat frozen on the plush white sofa, Richard's journal clutched in her trembling hands. The rain outside was a relentless drumbeat, a soundtrack to the storm that had just broken inside her. Her first instinct was a tidal wave of maternal denial. This couldn't be true. Julian, her loving son, a con man. It was unthinkable. But Richard's words, penned with such somber foresight, refused to be dismissed. Greed is a powerful and corrosive force. The image of Julian's earnest face, his reassurances that he was only thinking of her well-being, now seemed like a grotesque masquerade. The grief that had clouded her judgment for months began to recede, replaced by a chilling clarity. The shock was still there, a physical ache in her chest. But beneath it, something else was stirring, a flicker of the strong, resilient woman she had been before Richard's passing, the woman who had stood by his side as he built his empire from the ground up. She would not confront Julian, not yet. An emotional outburst would only give him the chance to spin more lies, to paint her as a confused, grieving old woman. No. Richard had left her a clue, a name, Fitzgerald. She needed proof, and Harrison Fitzgerald was the key. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She dressed carefully, choosing a classic Chanel suit Richard had bought her, a silent armor for the battle ahead. She bypassed the building's car service, which she now suspected reported her movements to Julian, and hailed a taxi on the street. The ride to Harrison Fitzgerald's law firm felt like a journey back in time, to a life of agency and partnership she had almost forgotten. Harrison, a man whose sharp legal mind was softened by the kind eyes of a lifelong friend, greeted her with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Eleanor, I was wondering when I might hear from you," he said, ushering her into his wood-paneled office. "Julian told me you were still too distraught to see visitors, and that you wanted complete privacy." The lie, so casual and yet so calculated, hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. "Julian has told me many things, Harrison," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "He told me you were retired and had passed on all of Richard's affairs." Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "Retired? My dear Eleanor, I'm still billing 200 hours a month. I handled Richard's estate personally, just as I've handled his legal work for 40 years. I have tried to contact you half a dozen times, but Julian always intercepted, saying you weren't well enough to speak." He gestured for her to sit, his expression hardening with professional gravity. "I've been deeply concerned. Tell me everything." Eleanor laid out the story, starting from Julian's proposal to sell the mansion to the declined debit card and the final damning entry in Richard's journal. As she spoke, Harrison listened intently, his fingers steepled, his face a grim mask. When she finished, he let out a long, slow breath. "I feared this," he said, his voice low and heavy with regret. "Richard feared this. He loved Julian, of course, but he was not blind to his son's moral flexibility, especially where money is concerned." Harrison rose from his desk and walked over to a large safe concealed behind a painting. He returned with a thick, leather-bound document. "This Eleanor, is your husband's true last will and testament. The documents Julian had you sign were likely a power of attorney and other forms designed to give him complete control of your assets. What he told you about the state of your finances was a carefully constructed fiction. He opened the will and began to explain. The numbers were staggering, far beyond what Julian had led her to believe. The mansion had sold for nearly double the price Julian had quoted her. Richard's art collection, which Julian had claimed was auctioned off at a loss, had in fact been sold privately to collectors for a king's ransom. In total, Richard's estate was worth over $50 million. Julian had created a small allowance account for her, the one with the debit card, while siphoning the vast majority into accounts he controlled. Richard was a brilliant man, Eleanor, Harrison continued, his voice tinged with admiration. He foresaw this possibility. He structured his will in a very specific way. He pointed to a clause deep within the document. He left you, his beloved wife, 75% of his entire estate, unconditionally. The remaining 25% was to be held in trust for Julian. Harrison paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the masterstroke. However, the disbursement of Julian's trust is contingent upon one very specific condition. He read the clause aloud. Said trust shall only be released to my son, Julian Vance, upon the 10th anniversary of my death, and only if he has, for the duration of that period, acted as a faithful and dutiful son, ensuring his mother's comfort, security, and absolute financial independence. The execution of this clause is to be solely determined by my wife, Eleanor Vance, and my attorney, Harrison Fitzgerald. Eleanor stared at him, speechless. Richard, from beyond the grave, had armed her. He had not just suspected his son's greed. He had laid a perfect, intricate trap for it. If Julian has failed to meet this condition, and from what you've told me, he has failed spectacularly, then his entire inheritance is forfeited. Harrison explained. The will further stipulates that the forfeited funds are to be redirected, in their entirety, to a charity of your choosing. A slow, fierce smile spread across Eleanor's face. The grief and fear that had paralyzed her were burned away by a white-hot flame of anger and determination. She was not a victim. She was the arbiter of her son's fate. So what do we do now? She asked, her voice clear and strong. Now, Harrison replied, a glint in his eye. We gather our ammunition. We need undeniable proof of his fraud and misappropriation of funds. I'll subpoena his bank records, trace the sales of the art, and get the real closing documents from the mansion sale. We need to build a case so airtight that he cannot possibly wriggle out of it. He leaned forward, his expression serious. This will require patience, Eleanor. You will have to go back to that apartment and continue to play the part of the blissfully ignorant mother. Can you do that? Eleanor thought of her cold, sterile apartment, her gilded cage, but it was no longer a prison. It was a staging ground, a place from which to plan her counterattack. She thought of Richard's love and foresight and the strength it gave her. She looked Harrison Fitzgerald in the eye, a general accepting her. Marching orders. Harrison, she said, her voice resonating with newfound power. I can do more than that. I can give a performance worthy of an Oscar. Returning to the sterile luxury of her apartment felt different this time. The panoramic windows no longer looked out onto a city of strangers. They offered a vista of her battlefield. The minimalist furniture, once a symbol of her displacement, now felt like the clean, uncluttered lines of a command center. Eleanor Vance, the grieving widow, had been left at Harrison Fitzgerald's office. In her place walked a woman with a purpose, a performer about to take center stage in the most challenging role of her life, the loving, oblivious mother. Her first performance came that very evening. She called Julian, her voice carefully pitched to sound frail and a little lost. "Julian, darling," she began, "I'm so sorry to bother you, but the television remote is being dreadfully complicated. I can't seem to find the channel for my favorite news program." On the other end of the line, she heard his barely suppressed sigh of exasperation. "Mom, it's the same remote as last week. Just press the guide button," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Oh, of course. How silly of me," Eleanor cooed. "My head is just so foggy these days. I don't know what I'd do without you, dear." It was a line delivered with such convincing helplessness that it almost made her sick to her stomach. But it worked. Julian's tone softened immediately, his ego placated. "It's no problem, Mom. I'll come by tomorrow afternoon to check on you. Maybe I can label the buttons for you," he offered, the magnanimous son tending to his dotty mother. "Oh, would you? You're such a good boy," she replied, ending the call and allowing her sweet smile to dissolve into a thin, hard line. Every patronizing word from him was another drop of fuel on her simmering fire. While Eleanor played her part, Harrison and his team of forensic accountants and private investigators moved with quiet, lethal efficiency. The information began to flow in, each new discovery a deeper cut of betrayal. They found the real records for the mansion's sale, revealing a shell corporation Julian had set up to obscure the true purchase price. He hadn't just lied about the amount, he had laundered it. The money from Richard's priceless art collection hadn't gone into a diversified portfolio for her benefit. It had been wired directly to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Harrison's private investigator, a former NYPD detective named Costello, began tailing Julian. The reports he sent back to Eleanor were a sickening chronicle of her son's double life. While she was living on the meager allowance he provided, Julian was living like a king. He had purchased a new Ferrari, put a down payment on a penthouse apartment in Soho for his much younger girlfriend, a budding actress named Tiffany, and was a regular at the city's most exclusive high-stakes poker games. Photographs showed him laughing, drinking vintage champagne, dripping with a wealth he had stolen from his own mother. Eleanor looked at the pictures with cold detachment, the pain of a mother's love curdling into the resolve of an executioner. He was no longer her son. He was a stranger wearing her son's face. Eleanor knew she needed something more, a piece of evidence that came from her own hand, a way to feel she was actively fighting back, not just waiting for reports. Her opportunity came during Julian's promised visit to label the remote. He arrived smelling of expensive cologne and impatience. As he fiddled with the television, Eleanor, carrying a tray with tea, feigned a dizzy spell. She stumbled, sending the tray crashing to the floor, splashing hot tea all over the front of his custom-tailored suit jacket. "Oh my goodness. Julian, I am so dreadfully sorry," she cried, dabbing at his jacket with a napkin, her performance of a flustered old woman now second nature. "It's fine, Mom. It's fine. Just relax," he snapped, shrugging off the jacket and handing it to her. "See if you can get this to a dry cleaner for me, will you? This is silk." "Of course, dear. I'll take care of it right away," she said, taking the jacket. It was the moment she had been waiting for. After he left, she laid the jacket on her bed, her heart pounding. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she went through the pockets. In the inside breast pocket, her fingers closed, around a small silver USB drive. It was a long shot, but Julian was arrogant, and arrogant people were often careless. She plugged it into the new laptop Harrison had provided for her, a device Julian knew nothing about. The drive was not password protected. It contained folders of spreadsheets, bank statements, and legal documents. It was his entire fraudulent enterprise, all laid out in black and white. He was meticulous. She had to give him that. He had detailed every transaction, every transfer, every lie. But it was another folder labeled debts that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just about a lavish lifestyle. Julian was in deep. He had lost millions in a series of bad investments and was in debt to a loan shark, a man known only as Mr. K. The files contained copies of threatening emails, detailing exorbitant interest rates, and increasingly dire warnings. The last email was chillingly specific. Vance, you have 1 month to pay the full amount. We know about your mother's inheritance. Get the money, or Tiffany will have a very nasty accident, and your mother will be next. We know where she lives. The room tilted. This wasn't just about greed anymore. Julian hadn't just stolen from her to fund a life of luxury. He had stolen from her to save his own skin, and in doing so, had put her directly in harm's way. He had sold her out, offered her up as collateral to dangerous criminals without a moment's hesitation. Any lingering shred of maternal sentiment, any microscopic grain of pity for the boy she had raised, evaporated in that instant. She copied the entire contents of the USB drive and then carefully placed it back in the jacket pocket. When Julian's assistant came to pick up the jacket the next day, it was freshly cleaned with the drive nestled safely inside, a ticking time bomb he was completely unaware of. That afternoon, she met with Harrison again. She laid out the new information, her face a mask of grim determination. Harrison read the threatening emails, his expression growing darker with each word. "This changes things, Eleanor," he said gravely. "This goes beyond fraud and elder abuse. This is reckless endangerment, conspiracy. The district attorney will have a field day with this. I don't just want to disinherit him, Harrison," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but as hard as steel. "I don't just want my money back. He put a target on my back. He gambled with my life as if it were a poker chip. I want him to pay for everything. He has done." Harrison nodded slowly. "The evidence is ironclad. We have enough to not only seize every stolen asset, but to ensure he faces significant prison time. The trap Richard set in his will is about to spring. The only question is, when do you want to spring it?" Eleanor looked out Harrison's window at the bustling city below. For months, she had felt invisible, a ghost in her own life. Now she held all the power. The performance was over. It was time for the final act. "Soon," she said. "But first, I want to see him. I want to look him in the eye one last time before we bring the curtain down. Here is the 4th section of your story. Please let me know when you are ready for the final section." The annual City Art Museum Gala was the crown jewel of New York's philanthropic scene, an opulent affair where old money and new ambition mingled under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. It was an event Richard had chaired for over a decade. This year, his son Julian had seamlessly stepped into his shoes, eager to cement his place as a worthy successor to the Vance legacy. He stood near the grand entrance, a vision of tailored perfection in a Tom Ford tuxedo, his arm possessively around Tiffany, who was draped in a glittering backless gown. He was the master of his universe, accepting condolences for his fathers, passing while simultaneously networking with the city's elite. He had no idea he was the guest of honor at his own execution. Eleanor had chosen her armor with the precision of a seasoned general. She wore a floor-length gown of deep emerald silk, a color that brought out the fire in her eyes. Around her neck lay the Vance diamond, a breathtaking necklace Richard had given her on their 40th anniversary, a piece Julian believed had been sold off with the rest of her jewelry. Her silver hair was styled in a chic, elegant chignon, and her posture was ramrod straight. As she entered the ballroom, a hush fell over the immediate vicinity. This was not the frail, grieving widow people had been whispering about for months. This was Eleanor Vance, the matriarch, in all her formidable glory. She saw Julian's eyes widen in shock, a flicker of disbelief followed by a flash of irritation. He quickly plastered on a smile and excused himself from his conversation, striding towards her with Tiffany in tow. "Mom, what a surprise. I didn't think you were up for this sort of thing," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. He leaned in to kiss her cheek, but Eleanor turned her head slightly so his lips met the air. "I felt it was time I started living my life again, Julian," she said, her voice cool and even. Her eyes swept over Tiffany, a dismissive glance that took in the expensive dress and jewelry he had bought with her money. "You must be Tiffany. Julian has told me so little about you." Before Tiffany could stammer a reply, Eleanor's gaze locked back onto her son. "In fact, there's a great deal you've told me little about. But we can rectify that." She smiled, a gesture that held no warmth. "I believe your table is this way. I have some people I'd like you to meet." Bewildered and off balance, Julian had no choice but to follow as Eleanor led him and Tiffany to his own table, where several of the museum's most influential board members were seated. Harrison Fitzgerald was already there, rising with a polite nod as they approached. Julian's composure visibly cracked at the sight of the lawyer. "Harrison," Julian said, his voice tight. "I wasn't aware you were attending. Eleanor was kind enough to invite me." Harrison replied smoothly, his eyes twinkling with a lawyer's predatory calm. Eleanor did not sit. She remained standing, a regal and imposing figure at the head of the table. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily to the surrounding tables, "I just wanted to thank my son, Julian, publicly. In the difficult months since my husband's passing, he has taken over the management of my entire life. He has been so thorough." The board members smiled politely, assuming it was a heartfelt tribute. Julian shifted uncomfortably, sensing the trap even if he couldn't see its jaws. "He was so thorough," Eleanor continued, her voice hardening almost imperceptibly, "that when he sold our family home, a place he knew his father loved dearly, he managed to secure a price of $12 million. Quite a feat in this market." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "Which is why I was so surprised when Harrison's accounting showed the true sale price was $22 million. I suppose the other $10 million was his commission for all his hard work." A wave of murmurs rippled through the nearby tables. Julian's face went pale, a stark contrast to his dark tuxedo. "Mother, this is hardly the time or the place." "Oh, but it's the perfect place," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest like glass. She slid a thin, elegant envelope from her clutch purse and placed it on the table in front of him. "And this is the perfect time. This is a statement from a bank in the Cayman Islands. I believe you'll recognize the account number. It's where you've been keeping the proceeds from the art collection you so cleverly auctioned off at a loss. You see, Richard kept a very detailed inventory, with each piece's appraised value. You are thorough, dear, but your father was brilliant." Julian stared at the envelope as if it were a coiled snake. Tiffany looked back and forth between them, her painted smile frozen in confusion and dawning horror. "As you know," Eleanor went on, her voice now a cold, clear bell of judgment, "your father's will was very specific, Your inheritance was entirely dependent on your ensuring my well-being and financial independence. I think we can all agree. You failed to meet the terms of your father's trust. Harrison will be filing the paperwork to have you formally disinherited in the morning." It was then that she delivered the final, fatal blow. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was nonetheless audible to everyone at the table. "And Julian, I do hope you find a way to pay back Mr. K. I understand he's a very impatient man, and he knows where I live. Or at least, where I used to live." The name hit Julian like a physical impact. All the blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, terrified sheen. He looked utterly broken, his carefully constructed world shattered. In the space of 2 minutes, he finally understood. She knew everything. Before he could even process the full scope of his ruin, the museum's chairman was on the stage, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special surprise announcement tonight. Please welcome to the stage a woman whose family has been the bedrock of this institution for half a century, Mrs. Eleanor Vance." Leaving Julian a hollowed-out shell, at the table Eleanor walked gracefully to the stage, bathed in the warmth of the spotlight. She looked out over the sea of stunned faces, her heart not filled with vengeance, but with a profound sense of peace and righteous power. She had done it. She had honored Richard's memory and reclaimed her life. "My late husband Richard loved this museum," she began, her voice resonating with strength and emotion. "He believed that art was not something to be hidden away, but a legacy to be shared. In that spirit and in his memory, I am pleased to announce the formation of the Richard and Eleanor Vance Foundation for the Arts. And as our inaugural gift, I am pledging a donation of $25 million to the museum." The ballroom erupted in a deafening wave of gasps and then thunderous applause. Eleanor simply smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. In the back of the room, she saw 2 discreet, well-dressed men, Detective Costello and his partner, begin to move, purposefully toward Julian's table. Her son's curtain had fallen. Hers was just beginning to rise. The applause in the grand ballroom felt like a distant ocean roar to Eleanor. She stood on the stage, bathed in the spotlight, but her focus was on the small human drama unfolding in the shadows. She watched as Detective Costello and his partner reached Julian's table. There was no struggle, no scene. The fight had already gone out of her son. He was a marionette whose strings had been cut, slumping in his chair as the detective spoke, to him in low, serious tones. Tiffany, seeing the men's badges and the utter finality in Julian's expression, simply stood up, smoothed down her glittering dress, and walked away without a backward glance, disappearing into the crowd like a phantom. Julian didn't even seem to notice. He rose mechanically and was escorted out through a side exit, his public life ending not with a bang, but with a quiet, ignominious whimper. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, but for Eleanor they were merely the epilogue. With the mountain of evidence Harrison had compiled, including the detailed records from the USB drive, Julian's case was indefensible. Faced with a list of charges that included grand larceny, wire fraud, and felony elder abuse, he accepted a plea bargain. The judge, citing the calculated cruelty and gross violation of trust, sentenced him to 10 years in a federal prison. The information Eleanor had provided on Mr. K also bore fruit. The loan shark and his criminal enterprise were dismantled by an FBI task force, removing the last shadow of threat from her life. Eleanor never moved back into the mansion on the Upper East Side. To do so would have felt like stepping back into a life that no longer fit her. That chapter, with all its gilded comforts and hidden frailties, was closed. Instead, she purchased the entire top-floor penthouse of a historic building overlooking Central Park. It was a space of light and air, with soaring ceilings and a sprawling terrace that she filled with lush greenery. She oversaw the design herself, choosing every piece of furniture, every color, every texture. It was not a monument to her past with Richard, but a testament to her own present. The centerpiece of her new home was a large, sun-drenched room she converted into an art studio, its walls soon to be filled with her own creations. The Richard and Eleanor Vance Foundation for the Arts became her life's passion. With Harrison Fitzgerald as the chairman of her board, she didn't just write checks. She became intimately involved. She personally reviewed grant applications, championing young unknown artists whose work was bold and unconventional. She funded art programs in inner-city schools, her heart swelling with pride as she watched children from impoverished neighborhoods discover a new way to see and shape their world. She was no longer just a custodian of Richard's legacy. She was actively shaping a new one that reflected her own belief in the transformative power of art. She was giving others the chance to find their voice, just as she had found hers. About a year after the gala, she drove upstate to the Federal Correctional Facility, where Julian was incarcerated. She didn't go for him. She went for herself, for the small boy she remembered with a scraped knee and a trusting smile, to say a final goodbye to his memory. The man she sat across from, separated by a pane of thick plexiglass, was a stranger. He was gaunt and sullen, the charm and arrogance stripped away, leaving behind a hollow core of resentment. He didn't apologize. He blamed her, Richard, the lone shark, everyone but himself. "You didn't have to destroy me," he rasped through the speaker. "We were family." "Family?" Eleanor replied, her voice devoid of anger, filled only with a quiet, sorrowful clarity. "Family doesn't put a price on a mother's life, Julian. Family doesn't build a prison of lies around someone they claim to love. You destroyed yourself with your own greed. My only role was to turn on the lights so you could finally see the ruin you had made." She stood up, her visit lasting less than 10 minutes. "Goodbye, Julian." She walked away without looking back, leaving the ghost of her son behind for good. That evening, back in her studio, Eleanor stood before a large, empty canvas. The setting sun cast long golden rays across the park, filling the room with a warm, gentle light. For months, she had felt a whirlwind of emotions: grief, betrayal, anger, and finally, a fierce, triumphant justice. But now, all of that was gone. In its place was a profound and liberating stillness. The silence in her apartment was no longer the suffocating blanket of loss it had once been. It was the clean, quiet air of possibility. She picked up a brush, dipped it in a bold, vibrant shade of blue, and touched it to the canvas. The first stroke, the beginning. She didn't know what the final painting would look like. And for the first time in her life, she was utterly thrilled by the not knowing. Her past was a finished work, its story told, its lessons learned. But her future was this blank canvas, an unwritten masterpiece waiting for her, and her alone to create it. And as she began to paint, Eleanor Vance, a woman reborn from the ashes of betrayal, finally felt completely and wonderfully free.